Plant versus animal fiber. What are the pros and cons? You may have always used animal fiber and kind of kept away from the plant ones, but if you developed an allergy, or perhaps you're finding that wool and animal fiber is too warm in the summer, then you might be open to the possibility of actually exploring a little bit more in the world of different types of fibers. Well, this is the video for you, so let's get started. When you started knitting, you may have found that you didn't really think about the fibers that you were using when you began. Usually it's going to be more cost-based as opposed to really thinking about how the fiber is going to behave and what it will feel like when you're finished wearing it. So once you get past the first couple of months or couple of years where you're really getting comfortable with the craft and you're ready to invest a bit more, at that point you may be starting to think about different fiber types and how they're going to behave and what they will be like when you wear them. For me, I started off after I began knitting. The next thing that I started with was working through different animal fibers, usually wool, but sometimes things like, yak, alpaca, which is very soft, and other fibers like that, mainly because one of the reasons to start knitting for me was to start bringing in fibers that I couldn't find in the shops. Most of the things that were available shop-wise tended to be acrylic based, or a very large portion of acrylic. So I was veering towards more natural fibers. We're in Ireland, it's very cold, so animal fibers tend to be a lot warmer. So those were up on the top of my preference. Then you're kind of balancing with animal fibers between durability, as in it may be a little bit rougher, but it's going to wear a lot better, versus something that's nice and soft, but it's going to take a lot more care because it's fragile, more prone to pilling and felting. So that's kind of a very, very broad outline of kind of my thinking as to why I started with animal fibers. But on the other side, you've also got plant fibers. You may have started with plant fibers out of necessity, because if you're allergic to different animals, then plant fibers may be a much more desirable option for you. Alternatively, it might be that you run really hot, and so you're in a warm climate. So you just find that animal fibers are too warm to wear, so you're just more attracted to plant fibers. For me, plant fibers started coming in fairly early on in my knitting journey. Like, as I said, I didn't want to use a lot of artificial fibers, but when I started, I was knitting a lot for my kids. Kids tend to run warm. They don't always like wool, because whether it is or not, they'll perceive it as scratchy sometimes. So I veered towards a lot of cotton yarns when they were small. The other advantage to that for me is that cottons tend to get very vibrant colors, and I love doing kids sweaters with stripes, so it meant that, and it's cheap, so I could get loads of different colors, stripe the yarn through, and actually have a lot of fun creating just fun, colorful tops for my kids. Downside to plant fibers, particularly things like cotton, is it can be a little inelastic. They tend to not quite have the same kind of bounce. So what that can do is sometimes it'll mean that it might be kind of hard on the fingers, because if you're tensioning it, it can kind of rub on the fingers and they can cramp up a little bit more. And also it's going to be a little bit unforgiving in terms of your stitch gauge, and how, because of the fact that the elasticity of animal fibers gives a little bit of bounce back to that. There are a few ways around it. So these are some of the ones we have in the shop. We've got the durable cotton, where you can see that it's fairly smooth, so it gives you a nice even stitch. It looks really good when you're knitting with it. And the other one that we have here is the Antigone, which is a linen. So linen is almost a little bit more extreme than cotton, because it's very, very unforgiving, and it is quite rough as you're knitting with it, with no elasticity for standard linens. Beauty of things like linen and cotton is that they soften up considerably when you wear them, when you wash them. They get softer and softer with each wear. I want to remind you that if there's anything you want to know about, or anything you'd like me to expand more on, stick a message in the comments down below, because this is your series and it's all about Ask a Knitter, so you determine which direction it goes in. So anything about yarn or fibers or patterns that go with things, or how to use them, just drop it in the comments and we'll build it into the series. In terms of knitting with them, I found that the best thing to do was to just relax my tension, to, like, if necessary, drop down a needle size, but just be very mindful of not holding the yarn too tightly, because it'll kind of end up cramping your fingers up. And you have to, it kind of takes a little bit of a different rhythm as you're knitting with it. So you may find that you need to swatch to get into a really comfortable flow for knitting with animal fibre, because it'll feel very, very different on your needles. You may want to try and swap between metal and bamboo needles. I found that metal was quite nice when I was working with animal fibre, because it doesn't, or plant fibre, because I just found that it allowed me to relax a bit and the stitches just kind of slipped along a little bit. Another alternative, it's not either of these, but you could also look out for what would be known as a chain neck construction. So that would mean the yarn is like very, very fine thread, and they're basically creating a knitted I-cord tube, or a little chainette stitch, so that actually introduces a little bit of bounce into it, just by virtue of the fact that the chainette bounces. It will give you kind of a hollow core, so it'll look a little different. But if you really like the idea of knitting with plant fibres but find them hard on the hands, then keep an eye out for a chainette construction in the actual yarn, and then when you pick it up you can bounce it. So basically, like, this is a plant fibre. This one is Donegal, soft Donegal, from Donegal Yarns, from Studio Donegal. And the way the yarn is twisted, and by virtue of the fact that it's from an animal, as you stretch it, you can see there's that little bit of bounce there. So that actually means that you can pull it, when you're tensioning it in your yarn and you're knitting, you can pull it quite tightly, and it's going to be fairly forgiving. It's not going to, it's not going to hurt your fingers too much. And if there's a little bit of unevenness in the stitches, the actual bounce back of that, particularly as it's blocked and it blooms, is going to be very forgiving. But with cotton, what you see is what you get. Linen a little bit less so. Linen will even out a little bit more, but with cotton you want to try and be careful that your stitch gauge is nice and even, because it will show. It's fairly unforgiving with how it shows up. But swatch, try different needle sizes, and it'll help quite a bit. In terms of what to knit with it, I mean, the kind of things that I veer towards for cottons would be short sleeved t-shirts, short or longer sleeved even sweaters, cardigans, just very, very simple cardigans. Moving towards things with, if you've got lace patterns, work really nicely in cottons and in linens, because that way you're worried a little bit less about the actual tension. It's already being knit at a slightly looser tension, and that actually means that when you block it, because you're blocking it more aggressively, opening the stitches out, that can actually help correct a little bit of the unevenness. So it lends itself, lace is going to be more open and more summery anyway, so it does lend itself to these style constructions. Another thing that I like to do with it is, if I've got mainly stockinette stitch, doing drop stitches, extra wrap stitches, things like in the summer drops top that I've got. That I've got one version I did in silk, another version that we did in the linen, and again those drop stitches really open it up and they allow these plant fibres to shine, I think. So why don't you share some of the plant fibres that you've used, ones that work well for you, kind of problems you've come up against, and maybe some patterns that you found that work really well in plant fibres. And don't forget to join us for our next video, which we'll be talking a little bit more in depth about some other yarns.